Gene Codes, Session 7. For this session, I want to go a little bit into generations and the saeculum. Many years ago, I came across a study by an academic duo, very powerful academic duo. I don't remember which university, but it was one of those sort of Ivy League prestigious universities. Neil Howe and I think William Strauss, because William Strauss is no longer with us, but Neil Howe is still around. Anyway, one I believe was a historian, the other was an economist. And the economist couldn't help but ask the question, what is causing the boom and bust in the economy historically? And they tried to brainstorm about different scenarios, what could it be, and ultimately in the end, after a long series of doing a bunch of research, they started to see that there was a pattern that not only followed economy, not only followed economics, but followed trends, historical trends and attitudes that different generations had. And so they came up with a model that basically says this. And the saeculum is where we get our word century. In fact, saeculum, the Italian word is secolo, and it obviously saeculum is the Latin form, and it really it technically means a period of 100 years, but in this context, when dealing with generations, it really means a cycle in which close to 100-year cycle, from 80 to 100 years, there is a repeating in the generations. Now, I'll go into it a little bit more, but what I want to start with, because we're starting with gene codes, because we're here to look at the idea that there is something embedded within our genetics, within our soul. Maybe it's not maybe it's not solely physical. But in one of the previous sessions, I talk about the idea that on a very deeper level, DNA is really made up of light photons. So when we talk about physical DNA, there's a physical manifestation for that. But on a deeper level, on the energetic level, because all of these gene codes have something to do with something innate, something inherent that is just part of nature. And the thing is that when something is part of nature, when something is natural, it creates rhythms, it creates patterns, and those patterns become observable. And when those patterns become observable, then you start to have answers to certain questions that didn't make sense before. But you're still left with, okay, well, where did this come from? Who or what programmed this in? Now, the generations are basically four. There are 4 generations, and the saeculum is basically what these 4 generations go through before a new cycle begins. Now, we usually like to begin, those of us who enjoy sharing this subject, we usually like to begin with the crisis period. In the saeculum, there are what I refer to, or what is known as 4 seasons. And it's not like the 4 seasons of the year, but there's a similarity to it. There's an analogy to it. And the reason why we like to begin with the crisis season, or what they call the turning, but I like to call it season. And don't think of season as a yearly thing. Think of a season as think of a century. Think of a century and think of 4 periods within that century that pass by, and they all have distinct qualities about them. And one of those periods, one of those seasons of the century is known as the crisis season. Now, why do we like to begin there? Well, because it is so familiar to people. When you think about crisis, it's something that remains in history. And so it's easy to refer to because people, when you mention it, oh yeah, we know about that. We know about the Great Depression. We know about the Revolutionary War. I mean, those people who are familiar with American history. Because you see, Neil Howe and William Strauss, they found in American history that there were these cycles. But then they later went to investigate outside of American history, so as to exclude the idea that this is only a American phenomenon. They found that these cycles also exist in other countries, and it is my belief that now that we are on a global level, that this cycle has been harmonized. In other words, the entire planet is experiencing, no matter where they may have found themselves on this cycle of the saculum, everyone now is finding themselves on the same cycle because we are all in crisis, period. And it really began around 2008, 2009 when we had the Great Recession begin. But now it's really being pushed harder, ingrained into the entire global community, into all of humanity. We are all passing through this crisis moment. Now, after the crisis moment, there's what's known as a high. And I don't know if I'm doing a really good job of trying to, because then I have to fit in the archetypes of the actual generations. But there's this crisis period, and we've known it throughout history. If you go back, I mean, if you have 2008, 2009, if you go back 80 years, you have the Great Depression of 1929. If you go back 80 to 100 years before that, I believe you had the Civil War in America. If you go back another 80 to 100 years, so you see that there is this cycle in which it's very easy to identify throughout history these crisis moments. And what happens in these crisis moments is that the structure of a society is really challenged. Humanity, or that particular society, is challenged to really look at what it is that has been created and how it is crumbling and how to let it fall apart so that you can rebuild. It's obviously a really bad time to go through. And the different generations deal with all of these different seasons in a different way. But after the crisis period, what you have is you have a high, what's known as the high, the season of the high. And if you think back to the ending of the last in America, because this is easier to describe with American history, at the end of the Depression, it culminated in World War II. After World War II, there was the victory. Soldiers came home. Women could go back to being home, instead of being in factories producing bullets and arms and things like that. There was a high. There was a euphoria. There was this whole new hope that we were living in a free world and victory is ours. And so America started to rebuild themselves. And this is the time period in which the baby boomers were born. And the baby boomers were one of those generations. Now, I'm not going to talk about that just yet because I think to lay out first the different seasons and then try to incorporate in the different archetypes of the generations is probably a little bit easier. It's been a long time. It's been quite a while since I've tackled this issue. I think the last time that 2009 is the last time I gave a public talk on the subject, and so you have to mind me. It has been a long time since I have talked about this. So what happens during the high is that society rebuilds itself up, and there's a lot of idealism. There is a lot of unity within the community. There's a sense of euphoria in that the crisis is over. We've learned our lessons. Now it's time to rebuild the society. After the high, what then happens is there's a reawakening. It's a kind of a spiritual reawakening. And if you think about the 60s, this is what that was all about. once a society starts to rebuild itself back up, I mean, if it's crumbled during the crisis and now it's building itself back up, after its initial beginnings of building itself back up, you reach a point where you're doing pretty good. You're far away, and you're far away enough from the crisis that you start to enjoy life and you start to get really creative. And so what you had was an entire generation that during, let's say, this period of the 60s and, maybe the first half of the 70s or the late half of the 50s, you had this period in time which was known as the reawakening or the awakening, in which the old standards become challenged. It's time for a new world. And this is because, now I have to, in order to make sense of this, you have to understand that the prophet generation, which are the idealists are the ones who come of age. So essentially what happens is during each season of the Saculum, a particular generation comes of age between 20 and 20 and on. A particular generation starts to define itself, and then they define the society and what the values are, what the mores are, and it's repetitive. The idealist, the word says it itself. They want to start, this generation wants to start looking for an ideal life. So there's a lot of creativity. There is a lot of rebellion. There's a lot of breaking new ground, allowing yourself to be different. And there's a return to individualism. See, what happens during the crisis is that the mentality of the generation starts to shift from individual to collective. Because when you're going through a crisis, humans naturally aggregate. They naturally come together. And they start to think about the whole. They start to think about the collective. And this is something that during the crisis is strong, and during the high is also strong, because you just come out of a crisis. You've learned the principles of being a community, of being together, of looking out for everyone else. And then what happens is once you start to move away from that crisis, a lot of people who were born in the 40s and 50s, they didn't know anything about World War II. They didn't know anything about the situation that people were, what it was like. They were kids that were growing up in the high. The crisis was over and it was a rebuilding time. So there's a kind of momentum that picks up. So when this generation comes of age during the reawakening, during the spiritual awakening, these are kids who were raised to believe that anything is possible. So they don't know much about crisis. And so you're shifting away now. Now you're shifting away from collective mentality and you're shifting back into an individual mentality, which then reaches a real peak during the next season, which is the season of the unraveling. After the spiritual awakening, you go into a kind of unraveling, because now you're going from one extreme to another extreme. And in the unraveling, you have a real high sense of individualism, a selfishness, of egocentricity. And the unraveling is when there's an awakening point that, wait a minute, the systems that we actually thought were great are failing us. And what's interesting is that these accompany the booms and busts of economy. So you have, in the high, the economy is going up. So everyone's feeling good about money and banks and government. But when you're in the crisis season, or you're in the unraveling, the word says it itself. It's the pulling apart of society. It's the tearing down of institutions, but in such a way that people retreat into individualism. It kind of reminds me of the concept of centralization, decentralization. I believe that this ebb and flow happens along the saculum. So during the crisis time, there's a call for centralization. And during the high, the centralization is developed. It's built up. But then during the awakening, that centralization begins to be challenged. Why can't we be free? Why can't, why do institutions have to have all of this power? And then in the unraveling, decentralization shifts into full gear. And then there's the sense of we're going to unravel the system. We're going to embrace the counterculture, and we're going to begin to make our own way. This is where we had the hacker revolution start, and people creating their own businesses, and a lot of, con artists and things of that nature. It's the unraveling. Society is unraveling. The centralized forces are beginning to be torn apart by decentralized forces, by the force of decentralization. Which, of course, this unraveling ultimately leads to, guess what? Another crisis point. So we are back to the crisis again. And how do most crises begin? With an economic collapse. The Great Depression of 1929, the Great Recession of 2008, 2009. You understand? The system starts to crumble when you have, wow, you know what I just thought of? How interesting that this new crisis period began when Bitcoin was launched. That's pretty fascinating. You see, I think that there's a whole different theory on the introduction of Bitcoin into the world, not as a force to free people, but as something that is meant to replace during a crisis. People listen, during a crisis period. One of the fascinating things that I remember about this subject, because there's a book called Generations. I mean, this is Neil Howe and William Strauss. They wrote a book called Generations, right? And then they followed that book up with The Fourth Turning. And I've read Generations, and I also read The Fourth Turning. But the interesting thing about the book Generations, because that's where it really starts. The interesting thing about the book Generations is that when Al Gore was the vice president of the United States, in his office, on his table, he had that book. Now, why is that relevant? Because it reminds me, and it should remind all of us, that these kinds of systems, this gene codes that I am sharing with you, once you understand human nature, if you are evil, you can understand how to manipulate human nature. If you're a good person, you can understand how to help human nature and go with the ebb and flow of life. But it does not surprise me that certain things have been happening and power elites have been ready. They pre-planned. They know these things are coming. I remember that there was a discussion concerning the crisis period, basically concerning the crisis period. And I don't know where the meeting was. I don't know if it was the Bilderbergs. I don't know if it was Davos. I think it may have been Davos because it was an economic forum. It was a place where people sat around a table and discussed the economic situation that lies ahead. And this was years ago. This was towards the beginning of the crisis period. And the discussion that was on the table with these power elites was this. The crisis period has begun. How do we want to manage it? Do we want the crisis period to be short and shocking or long and drawn out? Now, I don't know what they came to as a conclusion, but I'm seeing that it's long and drawn out because we are clear into 2021. This began in at the end of 2008. So we are clearly on this is the long and drawn out version. And during a crisis season, you have many unfortunate things. I mean, right now we're dealing with the COVID issue, and I don't think it's over. And I'm not talking about the COVID issue. I'm talking about the crisis. I think there is more to come. Usually crises culminate in some kind of war, unfortunately. I mean, when you go back through the saculum of the United States, you got World War II, you go back to the Civil War, then you had the American Revolution. And, the further back you go, you will see that these crises always seem to end in some kind of war, and then there's a high. So that is the 4 seasons. So you have this unraveling, and then you go back into a crisis period. Now, each one of these seasons gives birth to a generation. So let's start with the high. So you have this crisis period, and after the crisis period is over, look at World War II. It ends, and then you have the 40s and the 50s. And there's a generation being born during this time. And this generation is known as the prophet generation. Now, this prophet generation, right, and because you have to look at the generation that is being born, and you have to look at the generation that precedes it, the generation that is raising this generation. So the baby boomers are born in the 40s and 50s. They are being raised by parents and grandparents who went through the crisis. So now that the crisis is over, you have parents and grandparents who are really protective. They really appreciate life. They're not seeking ideals. They're happy to be out of the crisis. It's very important that you understand that, because it creates a mentality in the next generation. So this baby boomer generation, as it is known, this prophet generation, this generation of idealists, they're growing up. It's your Leave It to Beavers. Now I'm showing my age there. Most of you, you guys don't even know what the hell I'm talking about. Anyway, there's these really protected children. And there's this euphoria of the high. The crisis is over. So these children are taught, look, you can do anything you want in life. And this is where they get their idealist mentality. And the parents think about the parents who came out of the Depression, came out of World War II, how appreciative they were of life and how they didn't ask for much. So they lived within their means. They didn't really want a whole lot more out of life because they were just so happy to be out of the crisis. But these kids are growing up with the idea of there is no crisis. The world is mine to explore. The world is mine to conquer. The world is mine. My life is going to be something magnificent because my parents continue to tell me, my grandparents continue to tell me how wonderful life is now. Yeah, they talk about the crisis and the depression and how it was hard. But that's kind of, they're old stories to children. To children, it's kind of like way back because they don't know anything about it. So during this period of the high, the prophet generation is born. Okay? Now, when the prophet generation comes of age in the 60s and 70s, now they're 20, 25, and there's a whole new sense of they're being adults. The generational attitude shifts. Now that they are adults, they want to explore the world. They want to be the idealist that their parents told them that they could be. So there's a sort of revolution in the air. These children who grew up in a safe environment now want to really explore the world. So you had the 60s and the 70s, the hippies, the cool music, the way people dressed and their hair was different. These people, when they're young, they see their parents as being too conformist, but their parents went through a really difficult time. And so now these parents want to believe in society. They want to believe in big institutions, because when the crisis, when everything was falling apart, in the high, when things are being rebuilt back up, it's because society says, okay, build up, let the companies build up, let the banks finance, let the government guide, let the military do its job. And so there's a sense of trust in authority. Whereas the prophet generation, when they come of age, they start saying, well, why can't we question authority? You taught us to question everything. You taught us to be free in our expression. And so there was a lot of that during the 60s and 70s. Now, mind you, this is during the awakening period. What's happening during the awakening period is that another generation is being born. In the 60s and 70s, there's what's known as the nomad generation, which is being born to the baby boomer generation who were parents. Now they're growing up in a completely different mentality, in a completely different environment. The nomad generation is growing up now at a time in the 60s and 70s where parents were hippies and they were all cool and they were all, but there was also a sense of children were not given the attention that they needed. See, we're shifting away from the collective and we're shifting towards the individual mentality, the individualism. So these prophet generation, these baby boomers are raising what's known as Generation X or the nomad generation. Think for yourself. Don't trust authority. Don't trust big government. Don't trust this. Don't trust that. Be independent. And they were known as the latchkey kids because kids would go to school. I'm part of that generation, where even at 6 or 7 years old, you walk to school by yourself. Your parents would give you the keys to the house so that after school you would come home. That's why they call them the latchkey kids, because you'd have your keys to get back in the house. That'd be unheard of today. A 6-year-old, 7-year-old walking to school by himself. Oh man. But this is the generation that grew up during the awakening. And when they come of age, they reject the idealism of the parents. And not only that, but they see the institutions, the corruption, they see the greed, and they challenge it. And the nomad generation, they're called the nomads for that very reason, because there is such a strong shift into individualism that there is no sense of a collective identity. And this is where the season of the unraveling begins. When the nomad generation comes of age, they have no trust in institutions. They would rather just do things on their own. There's a lot of entrepreneurialism. There's a lot of job hopping. There's a lot of innovation because people don't really want to go into big anything, big government, big tech, big companies, big multinationals. So this generation is at this point coming of age and it's tearing down. And you can see a lot of this is reflected in the music. If you think about the music of the 80s and 90s, really rebellious music, whether you look at rock and roll or hip hop, it's just a lot of rebellious music, right? Now, mind you, right? Because there's a tapestry that needs to be weaved here. Once this generation of nomads comes of age, it's giving birth to another generation, the generation of the heroes. And the generation of the heroes are growing up and watching the parents be so individualistic. You can't trust anything. You can't trust anyone. You can't trust government. You can't trust companies. And the fascinating thing about kids is that kids they'll soak up what it is that you say, but then they'll rebel against you. They'll do the exact opposite. So this generation of heroes is growing up under the parents who are nomads and grandparents who are baby boomers, prophets, and they're growing up in a society that's unraveling. These hero children are just seeing the world seems like it's just falling apart. There's no trust anywhere. There's betrayal everywhere. Companies are not necessarily falling apart, but this scandal or that scandal. And so these children grow up with a sense of who can we trust if we can't trust one another? So they start to rebel against the parents who are very individualistic, and they start to become collectivists. They start to believe in the collective, believe in the community, stick together with your friends. When the whole phenomenon of the internet came about and social media and things of that nature, it was really the hero generation who really embraced it strongly, because the hero generation is drawn towards the collective mindset, because they've been hearing all of their lives not to trust anything. Everything is a mess. Everything is corrupt. And they don't want to really believe this because, hey, that's really a bleak, pessimistic look at your future. You're being raised by parents who basically are telling you, you have no future. So these kids kind of withdraw within their own collective community of their age, of their generation, and they start to create a distinct mentality that says, no, we're not going to be individualistic. We're going to depend on one another. We're going to draw together. And so this hero generation is being raised high, overly protected. They're overly protected because the nomad generation was left free, and during that time, unfortunately, there's a lot of kids that get kidnapped, a lot of abuse, molestation, and just, and it's a tough time. It's a tough time for kids who grow up during that period that they don't have the protectiveness that they should have from parents. So what happens is they become protective of their children. So the nomad generation raises the hero generation and becomes protective and even overprotective. The hero generation then comes of age, and when the hero generation comes of age, we hit the crisis. And in the crisis point, the hero generation, they're known as the hero generation because they're the ones who actually really live the full force of the crisis. Imagine, you're hitting your 20s, you're 25, and the whole world, you just grew up through an unraveling. You're watching the world just unravel, and everything seems pessimistic. Your parents are pessimistic. The world is just doomed. You come of age, and there is nothing. There's crisis. So you need a heroic generation in order to be able to get through a crisis season. And so that's why the hero generation is known as the hero generation, because they are the ones who heroically go through this crisis. And what's interesting is that the hero generation is, when it comes of age, during the crisis, another generation is being born, which is the artist generation. These are the young children of the crisis who grow up during the crisis. They see the crisis with their own eyes as children. They see the poverty. They see the disparity. And there is a really strong sense of collectivism. You see, now we're getting away from the individualism, and we've returned to the collectivism. The artist generation is raised under the hero generation, which was already raised in a protective environment. Now they are even more vigilant in protecting and being hyper protective of their children. Just look at and the last, since this crisis began, look how much child protection, look how much, and I'm not talking about child protection as a social, just parents being overly protective of their children, overly spoiling children. So these children that are growing up now during the crisis season, these are children who are overly protected, and they are taught a sense of, listen, we've got to stick together. We're going through a crisis. We all got to stick together in order to get through this. And it creates a whole new generation. It creates a pretty passive generation. And this will be the generation, this artist generation will be the generation who raises the next prophet generation. And so the cycle repeats itself. Now, why is this interesting now? What relevance can we look at now? What's interesting is that when I gave this talk, last time that I gave this talk was in 2009. And the title of the talk was Our Spiritual Winter Has Arrived. And this was in 2009. And I was telling that small little group of people, that small little public that came out to hear me, I said, we are at the beginning of a crisis. It is time to prepare yourself. The crisis will be long. This is not a recession that's going to be over with next year, like they're telling you in the news, like, we're going to rebound, we're going to pick back up again. I said, no, get in this for the long haul, because it's going to be a really challenging time. I even myself was frightened by the idea that I was aware. Here's the thing that was pretty scary. To be conscious, to be aware that you are at the beginning of potentially a 20-year period of a crisis. How do you prepare for something like that? How do you go through something like that? How do you muster up the strength to say, oh my God, how am I going to survive this next 20 years? I mean, we are going into the greatest depression ever. We're probably going to be faced with war and all kinds. I mean, who would have ever imagined this COVID situation? We are in crisis season. And when I gave that talk, I kind of went home with it wasn't a pleasant talk. And I was told that the people said, I really didn't find this talk to be pleasant. And I said, well, I didn't give this talk to be pleasant. I gave this talk to give a heads up and kind of warn people. And now look at us. This was years ago, 2009. It's been well over 10 years. And this is only the midway point. I mean, we still have probably another 8 years to go. If we're lucky, maybe 5 or 6, but I think this is going to go on for a little bit longer. So what's interesting and relevant is to understand that we are going through this crisis period. This is where we are. And if you are conscious and aware of this kind of information, then you can plan your life a little bit differently. You can manage your emotions a whole lot differently because, listen, we are in the crisis season. This is what I refer to as the spiritual winter. We are in the spiritual winter. We are being challenged now. And it's really, like I said, each generation experiences each season differently. Now, I'm not going to go into that because then that would really extend this out, because you have to understand each season has all 4 generations present, and each generation contributes something to that season, because they're all present. But then once one season finishes out, see, we're in the crisis season now. When this crisis season is over, all of the prophets, the baby boomers, they'll all be gone. And there will be a new cycle of prophets born after this crisis, who will have no connection other than history books. And so this whole new prophet generation will be born. The cycle will go on. And what's relevant now is to understand that we are in this crisis season. You can stop believing what they're telling you about how the economy is going to rebound and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. But even more relevant is what I brought up before. The elites, they know about these cycles. And they know how to play these cycles, manipulate people within these cycles. They know what generations are being born. They know what the hero generation right now is doing. They know what the nomad generation right now is doing. And when you know that you have these natural cycles, you can know how to play them. You can know how to make decisions to kind of push your agenda, knowing that that agenda will be accepted because it is the proper time period to have that agenda be accepted. So I find it also fascinating that there is all of this hoopla about decentralization. Wrong season. This is the season of centralization. Whether you like to accept that or not, it is. So a lot of talk about decentralization, this is not the right moment. This is really not the right moment. I mean, you can go ahead, you can plan it out. But, those of you who are really pushing hard for decentralization, let's hope you'll be around 20 years from now, because 20 years from now, 25 years from now, maybe even 30 years from now, your ideas may take wind, may take form. So if you are really genuine about what you're putting out there, know that you are putting it out there for the future and not for the present. Know that you will not have the great mass adoption that you are looking for, because this is not the era of decentralization. This is the era of crisis when everything is falling apart and people are going to be calling for centralization. People are going to be demanding centralization in order to build society back up again. Listen, it's been fun. It's been great. I have not tackled that issue in a long time, and I have to say, I feel like I did a pretty good job. In the beginning, I felt like I was really going to stumble with this because, we're talking about some academic, intellectual stuff, but I think I did a pretty good job of at least getting you interested and getting you to understand that there are natural cycles in life, and these are one of them: generations and the saeculum. Listen, thank you everyone for the support. We will catch up soon on another session of Gene Codes, where we have a lot of other fascinating issues to go through. And thank you very much for listening.